Traoré's bold gamble. Why 15 million banana trees could save Burkina Faso from the desert. The Sahel is a land where the desert seems eternal, where winds carry dust more than rain, and where generations were told survival meant submission to aid. Yet in the heart of this land, Captain Ibrahim Traore stood before his people and declared the unimaginable. 15 million banana trees would rise across Burkina Faso's savanna. To outsiders, the announcement sounded absurd. Bananas in a region defined by drought and creeping sand? The world mocked. Foreign experts sneered. Diplomats whispered that Traoré was gambling with his nation's survival. But to Burkina citizens, the words struck like thunder. For once, a leader was not telling them what they could not do. He was daring them to see fruit where others saw dust, to harvest dignity where others predicted despair. This was not merely about bananas. It was about sovereignty, about whether an African nation long defined by fragility could write its own destiny with green leaves and golden fruit. Stay close. This story is more than about farming. It is about dignity, defiance, and destiny. Subscribe now so you walk with us through a revolution rooted in the soil. Burkina Faso, a nation carved into the dry belly of the Sahel, has long been defined by scarcity. Its people have faced dust storms that blackened the skies, erratic rains that mocked the hopes of farmers, and creeping desertification that consumed field after field. For decades, the narrative was fixed. This was a land destined to struggle, a land dependent on charity from abroad. And then came a declaration that shook not only the nation, but the world. Captain Ibrahim Traore, a young officer turned leader, stood before his people and announced that 15 million banana trees would be planted across the savanna. Not in green valleys, not by great rivers, but in the sun-scorched plains that foreign experts had written off as barren. The announcement rippled outward like an earthquake. Newspapers in Europe mocked it as the folly of a dreamer. Aid officials warned of water shortages. Agricultural economists shook their heads at the idea of bananas thriving in such a climate. Some diplomats whispered that Traoré was risking not just his credibility, but his nation's survival. Yet within Burkina Faso, the reaction was startlingly different. To the Burkina people, long told what they could not achieve, the vision was electric. For generations, they had been told they could not resist the desert, could not prosper without foreign donors, could not feed themselves without imports. Suddenly, their leader was speaking a new language, a language of defiance, a language of possibility. Every tree we plant, Traoré declared in a televised address, is a declaration of independence. We will not beg for bread while our soil can give us fruit. We will not import feed for our livestock while our own trunks can sustain them. We will not export our dignity to foreign corporations when we can export fruit ourselves. Why bananas? The question circled endlessly. Traoré's answer was simple but strategic. Bananas were not just fruit. They were a system. They matured quickly, often within a year, creating food security far faster than other cash crops. They provided versatility, eaten fresh, dried for storage, ground into flour, or transformed into snacks for markets. Their trunks and leaves, far from being waste, could be converted into feed for chickens, goats, and cattle, cutting costs for animal husbandry. Perhaps most importantly, bananas thrived in clusters, shading the ground, protecting moisture, and acting as green shields against desertification. Economically, the gamble was as audacious as it was ecological. For decades, Burkina Faso's exports were dominated by cotton and gold, two commodities vulnerable to global price shocks and foreign control. Bananas offered a new frontier. Global demand was immense, with billions of tons consumed each year. West Africa already produced bananas, but almost entirely in coastal nations like Côte d'Ivoire. If a landlocked country like Burkina Faso could claim a place in that market, it would not only defy geography but rewrite the rules of trade. And so the plan was unveiled, not as a quiet policy drafted in foreign offices, but as a call to arms. Traoré framed it not as agriculture but as resistance. He called the orchards to be a banana army. Each tree is a soldier, he told a crowd in Ouagadougou. 15 million soldiers who will fight hunger, fight poverty, and fight humiliation. The metaphor cut deep. A country long used to sending its sons to war with rifles was now sending its families to battle with seedlings. The mobilization was immediate. Schools became nurseries, with children tending young plants as part of their civic duty. Soldiers, once deployed only against insurgents, now dug trenches, carried seedlings, and built irrigation systems. Women's cooperatives were trained in cultivation and preservation, while local radio stations broadcast songs urging communities to plant for freedom, plant for tomorrow. In every corner of the country, the banana tree became more than a crop. It became a patriotic symbol. Still, doubts lingered. Could 15 million seedlings survive the merciless Sahel sun? Would fragile irrigation systems collapse? Would global markets welcome desert bananas? These questions haunted the project from its first day. But for the Burkina people, questions were not deterrents. They were challenges to be answered in soil and sweat. For the first time in living memory, hope was not an import. It was sprouting, fragile but alive in their own land. But could bananas really rise where the desert reigned? The first season after the bold announcement came like a trial by fire. Trucks rumbled along dusty tracks, unloading millions of fragile banana seedlings into the hands of farmers, soldiers, and schoolchildren. Families gathered in fields that had long lain barren, digging holes with hoes and machetes, pouring water into dry earth as though baptizing the land itself. The planting season resembled a national festival, but soon the harsh realities of the Sahel struck back. The sun blazed without mercy. Rainfall, when it came, fell too much in 1 week and then vanished for months. Termites gnawed at tender trunks. Goats wandered into fields, toppling young plants. And then the worst blow. Photographs circulated of withered seedlings. Entire fields turned into graveyards of shriveled stalks. International critics pounced. "We told you so," sneered one foreign agronomist. Bananas cannot grow in the desert. Western newspapers published scathing headlines, mocking the initiative as proof of naive leadership. Economists warned that resources were being squandered on a dream. Diplomats whispered that the project might spark unrest when inevitable failure came. It was at this moment that Ibrahim Traore showed the core of his leadership. Instead of retreating, he traveled personally to the hardest-hit zones. Standing among dead plants with farmers staring in despair, he lifted a withered trunk and held it aloft. "This one is gone," he told them, his voice broadcast across the nation. "But another will stand. Sovereignty does not sprout in one season. It grows with persistence." Those words transformed the mood. Failure was not seen as defeat, but as training for resilience. Across radio and village squares, his defiance was repeated like scripture. Plant again. Try again. Stand again. Behind the rhetoric, science began to march alongside determination. Agronomists introduced drought-tolerant banana varieties from East Africa. Solar-powered drip irrigation systems were installed in pilot zones, fed by small reservoirs designed to survive dry spells. Farmers were taught to mulch the soil with grass and crop residue, shielding roots from the burning sun. Traditional Z-pits, circular holes dug to capture scarce rain, were adapted for banana seedlings. Every setback sparked innovation. Communities rallied with almost military discipline. Women's cooperatives organized dawn watering shifts, carrying buckets of water to fields before the sun rose too high. Youth brigades patrolled plantations to keep livestock at bay. Soldiers, once trained only for border defense, now built fences, repaired pumps, and dug irrigation trenches. What had once been just farming was now framed as national defense. Slowly, green began to fight back against brown. Survival rates rose. Villages that had lost half their seedlings now celebrated fields where rows of banana leaves unfurled like banners against the wind. Shade appeared where once the soil had cracked. Farmers began planting beans and onions beneath the protective canopy of young banana groves. Even before bananas bore fruit, the intercropped harvests were easing hunger. The psychological impact was profound. For generations, the savanna had symbolized drought, despair, and dependency. Now it carried oases of hope. Farmers looked at their banana trunks and said, "This tree is my bank. When it fruits, I will feed my children and sell to the market. It will not betray me like foreign companies." Traoré's speeches fanned the fire. "The desert thinks it is eternal," he declared to a rally. "But every tree we plant is a bullet against it. 15 million bullets, 15 million victories." Citizens who had once despaired of sending sons to endless conflict now sent seedlings into battle with pride. Schoolchildren sang songs about the banana army, Elders blessed saplings as though baptizing them into the nation's struggle. The outside world remained skeptical. Aid agencies warned of water depletion. Corporations controlling West Africa's banana exports whispered their concerns to governments, fearful of competition. Journalists dismissed the campaign as mere populism dressed in green. But within Burkina Faso, the effect of those doubts was the opposite of what critics expected. Each insult became fuel for pride. Every sneer became proof that the world feared their independence. By the second planting season, the movement no longer depended on speeches alone. It had become a ritual woven into the life of every community. Women carried seedlings to fields wrapped in cloth as if carrying newborns. Soldiers planted side by side with farmers. Priests and imams alike blessed the groves. In every village, hope grew not as an abstract promise, but as a living trunk that demanded care, persistence, and faith. For a nation long belittled as fragile, mocked as incapable, the banana trees stood as defiance embodied in green. Still, the world said the desert will always win. Were they right? The impact of the banana revolution did not wait for decades to be felt. Even before the first large-scale harvests, change began to ripple through the villages and towns of Burkina Faso. Where once families faced hunger at the end of each dry season, now beans, onions, and groundnuts planted beneath the shade of banana groves filled cooking pots. For the first time in memory, families spoke of surplus rather than scarcity. The first ripe bananas were treated like treasures. Children carried them to markets with pride, women sliced them into strips to dry beneath the Sahel sun, and elders tasted the sweetness and declared, "Hope has returned to our land." Though modest in numbers, those first bunches carried a symbolic weight far heavier than their kilos. They represented proof that the desert could be resisted, that mockery from abroad could be silenced, that dignity could grow in Burkina's soil. Economically, the transformation was swift and tangible. Local markets that had once depended on imported rice or foreign wheat began to display baskets of fresh bananas. Within 2 years, convoys carried fruit to Ouagadougou and Bobo-Dioulasso. Urban families, once resigned to expensive imported fruit, now bought Burkina bananas at affordable prices. Restaurants began adding banana-based dishes. Schools integrated bananas into meal programs, feeding children with food grown in their own nation. But the impact reached far beyond diets. Women's cooperatives seized the opportunity. With training in cultivation and preservation, they became producers, traders, and leaders. Banana chips and banana flour became profitable products, giving women not only income but influence. For generations, women had been the backbone of Burkina households, but excluded from economic decision-making. Now, as heads of cooperatives, they controlled finances, negotiated with buyers, and invested in community projects. "Before we begged," said one cooperative leader. "Now we decide." Youth, too, found purpose in the orchards. For a generation tempted by migration or pulled into conflict, banana cultivation offered livelihood and dignity. Young entrepreneurs launched startups producing banana beer, banana bread, and even eco-friendly packaging from banana fiber. Instead of fleeing to cities or abroad, young people began to see their villages as places of opportunity. Migration slowed. Communities stabilized, and then came livestock. Banana trunks and leaves, once discarded as waste, were shredded into fodder for goats, cattle, and chickens. Feed costs plummeted, and animal productivity soared. Chickens laid more eggs, cattle produced more milk, goats fattened quickly. Manure from the animals, in turn, fertilized the banana groves, creating a cycle of abundance. Farmers began to describe the banana tree not simply as food, but as a mother. "She feeds us twice, once with fruit, once with fodder." Politically, the effects were just as dramatic. For decades, Burkina Faso's politics had been dominated by dependency on donors. Leaders crafted budgets around foreign aid, while citizens expected handouts during each food crisis. The banana revolution shifted that psychology. Villages funded wells and schools from cooperative profits. Roads were repaired not by foreign projects, but by local councils empowered with revenue. Clinics were stocked not through charity, but through trade. Traoré seized on this transformation to reshape the national narrative. "Sovereignty," he told Parliament, "is not a flag or an anthem. It is a mother who feeds her child from her own soil. It is a father who earns by his own hands, not by foreign pity. It is a people who trade not as beggars but as equals." His words resonated deeply in a nation that had tasted both dependency and dignity. The political culture began to change. Citizens no longer measured leaders by how much aid they attracted, but by how much resilience they built. National pride swelled. Instead of being pitied as a fragile state, Burkina Faso was spoken of as a pioneer. Of course, the challenges did not vanish. Droughts still came. Global markets still fluctuated. Pests still threatened. But the nation no longer faced these challenges empty-handed. It faced them with orchards, cooperatives, and a spirit of defiance. That shift, from fragility to resilience, was itself revolutionary. By the fifth year, hunger rates had dropped dramatically. Child malnutrition fell. Rural incomes rose. Villages once hollowed out by migration grew lively again. The banana groves had not only reshaped the landscape, but also the social fabric of the nation. The world outside still struggled to understand. How could a landlocked, drought-prone nation create abundance where science said it was impossible? But for Burkina citizens, the answer was clear: resilience, unity, and a refusal to accept dependency as destiny. Do you see this as the true path Africa needed all along? Share your thoughts below. But if bananas could change villages, what would they do to the world's balance of power? The world had watched with disbelief when Captain Ibrahim Traoré first announced the planting of 15 million banana trees. In foreign capitals, the idea was dismissed as folly. Development banks called it unrealistic. Western newspapers mocked it with headlines likening bananas in the Sahel to castles built in sand. International corporations controlling the banana trade whispered warnings to their governments, fearing competition from a landlocked nation that had dared to rewrite the rules. Yet as the groves survived, then thrived, the global tone began to shift. Environmentalists noted how banana plantations slowed erosion, trapped moisture, and created microclimates in one of the planet's harshest regions. Development journals studied the project as a rare case of climate-smart agriculture. Economists began to speak of Burkina Faso as a model for diversification: food for people, fodder for animals, and fruit for export, all from a single crop. What had been ridiculed was now studied. The reactions were not uniform. Across West Africa, ordinary citizens marveled at the transformation. Neighboring Mali and Niger sent delegations to observe the groves, asking whether similar revolutions could unfold on their own soil. In the Gulf, investors saw opportunity, signing contracts for shipments of what they branded bananas of the Sahel. In Europe, niche supermarkets proudly displayed Burkina bananas as exotic treasures, proof that resilience could be cultivated against all odds. In Washington and Paris, however, the mood was mixed. For decades, Burkina Faso had been a recipient of aid, a fragile state dependent on donor funds. Now, its leader had openly defied that system, refusing to wait for feasibility studies, foreign loans, or the blessing of aid agencies. Every tree planted without permission was a quiet rebellion against the hierarchy of global development. Analysts in Western think tanks admitted unease. If a drought-prone nation could break free of aid dependency through determination and innovation, what message would that send across Africa? Would other nations follow suit, choosing self-reliance over donor dictates? Would the grip of aid, loans, and dependency weaken in a continent long described as aid-dependent? For African citizens beyond Burkina Faso, the message was clear and powerful. A leader had stood up and declared independence not in speeches alone, but in orchards that fed people and generated trade. Sovereignty was no longer abstract. It was edible, visible, and exportable. The banana groves of Burkina Faso became more than agriculture. They became symbols of a continent daring to challenge old assumptions. And yet one question lingered. Was this only the beginning of Africa's agricultural revolution? By the end of the first decade, Burkina Faso's savanna no longer looked like the barren plains of memory. Where dust storms once rolled, green corridors stretched toward the horizon. 15 million banana trees stood not merely as crops, but as monuments to persistence. Yet the story was far from finished. The future carried both opportunities and risks. On one path lay expansion. Agronomists spoke of extending banana belts deeper into the Sahel, combining them with other resilient crops like millet, sorghum, and cassava. Solar-powered irrigation networks could transform dry zones into mosaics of productivity. cross-border collaborations with Niger and Mali hinted at a wider green belt of the Sahel, a continental strategy to fight desertification with roots and leaves instead of speeches and promises. But risks loomed. Climate change promised harsher droughts and more unpredictable rainfall. Global banana markets remained volatile, subject to price shocks and competition from coastal producers. Pest outbreaks could wipe out entire plantations if vigilance faltered. Success had brought visibility, and with it, the watchful eyes of corporations and governments wary of an African nation claiming sovereignty through agriculture. For Traoré, the question was not whether challenges would come, but how Africa would face them. His message to citizens was consistent. Resilience lies not in avoiding hardship, but in persisting through it. For Burkina farmers, sovereignty was not a political slogan, but a daily practice: watering, fencing, planting, and harvesting with dignity. The broader choice lay with Africa itself. Would other nations follow Burkina Faso's path, daring to imagine orchards in deserts, fisheries in dry riverbeds, energy grids built by local hands? Or would they remain tethered to aid and external dictates, waiting for permission to pursue their dreams? For the African diaspora, especially elders in America who had long prayed for a day when the continent would stand tall, the banana groves offered a living answer. They proved that Africa could feed itself, trade with dignity, and inspire the world not through dependency, but through defiance. Festivals in Ouagadougou now celebrated the harvest with parades of farmers carrying bunches of bananas like trophies of sovereignty. Children recited poems about orchards of freedom. Artists painted murals of green shields rising against the desert. The narrative had shifted. Africa was not a continent of victims, but of visionaries. And yet the prophecy remained unfinished. Bananas had shown what was possible, but the future demanded choices. Would Africa scale this revolution into every field, every village, every border? Would the seeds planted in Burkina Faso grow into a continental transformation? The desert still lingered, vast and patient. But so too did the orchards, stubborn and green. Between them lay the destiny of a continent. The bananas of Burkina Faso were more than fruit. They were a prophecy. But where does the prophecy lead? What began as a gamble, laughed at by newspapers and dismissed by experts, ended as a continental legend. 15 million banana trees, planted in defiance of drought and doubt, transformed Burkina Faso from a nation defined by scarcity into a beacon of possibility. The groves were more than agriculture. They were symbols of sovereignty. They were proof that a people long told they could not resist the desert, could not prosper without aid, could not feed themselves without imports, had broken those chains. Each tree had been more than a plant. It had been a statement, a promise, a declaration that dignity could be harvested from Burkina soil. The results spoke louder than speeches. Hunger rates fell. Villages reinvested in schools, clinics, and wells with their own earnings. Women rose to leadership through cooperatives. Youth found purpose and enterprise in orchards instead of migration or conflict. Livestock thrived on banana stalks. Exports filled cargo ships bound for the Gulf, Europe, and Asia. Sovereignty had ceased to be an anthem. It had become a daily reality. For Africa, the message could not be ignored. If a drought-prone, landlocked nation could build abundance where the world saw only dust, what could others achieve if they dared? The banana groves became a mirror held up to the continent, reflecting not fragility but resilience, not dependency but determination. This is the lesson of Sahel Desert Farming, that innovation and persistence can turn the impossible into the inevitable. It is also the living testimony of Ibrahim Traore Agriculture, proving that leadership rooted in vision can cultivate sovereignty as surely as orchards yield fruit. And so, the story closes not with an ending, but with a challenge. For the Burkina people, the future now grows green in their soil. For Africa, the choice remains. Will the prophecy of bananas be embraced, expanded, and shared? If this story stirs your spirit, do not let it fade into silence. Like, share, and subscribe. Our ancestors planted hope. Now it is our turn to harvest destiny. In the comments, lift your voice with pride. New Africa. Africa can do it. It's time for Africa. Because sovereignty is not gifted. It is planted, watered, and defended until the desert yields to green.